Hi, everyone. It is so nice to be here. This is not beer, even though the can looks like it. It's water. Let's see where to put it. Well, I just want to say it's such an honor to be at this library. I've just learned a little bit about it, and you're so lucky to live in a community with such amazing cultural programming. So thank you to the library, and thank you also to the Hudson Garden Club for this amazing invitation and support to be able to come here from New York. This is my first time in Ohio, and it's already been fabulous. What a sweet town. Okay, shall we begin? So, my book is called The Light Eaters, and it's about a hidden world that frames all of our lives. Plants are literally everywhere, and they are so influential in our lives in ways we really have not yet grasped, and they're able to do things we have hardly before realized. This is possibly an unsettling concept, or at least it should be, given that they outnumber us by their sheer living mass by a ratio of 8,000 to 1. We are profoundly outnumbered by creatures we hardly understand. And in fact, the scientists who study them have hardly understood them themselves either, and they're ready to admit that when you speak to them. In some cases, the things they're learning very recently feel like the sort of things we should have known for at least 100 years. But to start, I want to take us all the way back to the ancient world of the 1970s, when a scientist named David Rhodes noticed something strange happening in a forest near where he worked at the University of Washington, where he studied insects. For years, a blight of tent-forming web caterpillars had been defoliating these trees. So on the left, you have red alders. On the right, you have Sitka willows. And they were succumbing by the hundreds. Now, of course, to defoliate a tree, to have a caterpillar eating its leaves, is the equivalent of that tree being visited by a famine. If it doesn't have leaves, it can't eat light, and it starves to death. But then all of a sudden, after a couple of seasons, the tide turned. The caterpillars started dying off, and the trees bounced back. The forest recovered. But what had happened to the caterpillars? David Rhodes knew what all ecologists know, which is that everything in an ecosystem happens for a reason. Absolutely nothing is pure chance. And the reason he found was that the trees took revenge. The willows and the alders had changed the chemistry of their leaves to make them less nutritious. In a sense, they'd won this war by slowly starving the caterpillars to death. And even more surprisingly, it wasn't just the caterpillar-ravaged trees that had changed the chemistry of their leaves. Trees that had not yet been touched by a caterpillar had changed their chemistry too. It was like they had advanced warning, like they knew there was a plague afoot, and they started preparing themselves. A shocking possibility presented itself. The trees must be signaling to one another. So Rhodes published his findings in 1983, suggesting that the trees may be using some kind of gas, some airborne gas, to communicate the threat to one another. This particular paper would eventually change the course of botany, but in a very cruel twist, it would end Rhodes's career, because at the time, no one believed him. So now we know plants communicate. This is completely standard botany today. And in the years since Rhodes's paper came out, other researchers found that not only can plants emit these airborne chemicals to warn each other, but they can signal differently with their genetic kin than with non-related plants. They can use sort of back channels to signal only to genetic siblings, and in some circumstances, broadcast the threat more broadly to other species. In plants like sagebrush on the left and goldenrod on the right, researchers have discovered that plants can actually have regional dialects. If a community of plants is isolated on a hillside or in a valley, they can form these local variations of the more universal chemical signal, the more universal language. And of course, geographic isolation is also how our own regional dialects are formed. Their capacity to synthesize these chemical compounds and deploy them amounts to a sense entirely separate from anything we have. But I told the story of Rhodes to remind us of something. Science is an incredibly conservative institution for very good reason. Scientists really understand their responsibility to be very skeptical, to become a backstop against quackery and falsehoods emerging into the scientific literature. But that also means that scientists are profoundly resistant to scientific discovery. And this is a known and studied by scientists phenomenon. That means truly new ideas in science take time to pierce that veil of skepticism and become mainstream science. So Rhodes himself died believing his life's work was incorrect. Because in response to all this criticism that he got at the time, he tried to duplicate his work like any good scientist. And he replicated his study in the fall, even though his original study was done in the spring. And what was not known in the early 80s was that plants go through seasons in their chemical signaling, just like they do in many other processes in their life. It wasn't that Rhodes was wrong, of course. There were just more variables hidden from his view. The world is a prism. It's not a window. Wherever we look, we find new refractions. But I tell this story to remind us that science at any moment in time is just a snapshot of what its field believes. It can change its mind dramatically. Plants can communicate. And I believe it's in a moment of doing that right now about plants as a whole. So I want to acquaint us all with a revolution going on very quietly in the halls of botany. Scientists are discovering plants can do remarkable things, and the more that botanists uncover about the complexity of plants' forms and behaviors, the less traditional assumptions about plant life seem to apply. And what they're finding are provoking these questions. Are plants intelligent? Could plants be conscious? And how would we even understand consciousness in an organism that has no brain? So I'm going to introduce you to some of the remarkable feats scientists are discovering plants can do, and then we'll walk through what it means to find these capabilities in organisms without brains. And then we'll think about why this whole idea is so surprising to us at all. How did we ever decide that plants weren't remarkably plastic, active, alert, sensing beings? And then we'll think about what might happen if we decided to admit plants into the realm of things we consider truly animate in our minds. But first, it's very important to remember there's no scientific definition for terms like intelligence or consciousness. These are all very mushy words with multiple meanings. And it's also a reminder that human language is very limited. Consciousness is the mushiest word of all. We have not figured out the mechanical substrates for consciousness in ourselves, let alone any other thing. We know we can knock ourselves unconscious, but we don't know how anesthetics work, which another unsettling fact as far as I'm concerned. But we do know that anesthetics also work on plants. Pea seedlings, which is what these are an amazing reminder that plants are moving all the time, even if it's too slow for us to notice. And I'm hoping this works. Here we go. These are pea seedlings under normal conditions, and the minutes are in the top left corner. So this is how much they're moving over a course of 25-ish or so minutes. But when you put pea seedlings under a bell jar and suffuse it with diethyl ether, their movement grinds to a halt. Their tendrils curl inward, they just cease moving. Of course, diethyl ether is what was used for human surgeries for decades. When it comes to these pea seedlings, if you remove the bell jar, they will start moving again within 15 minutes. So again, consciousness is a mystery, even in us, yet we humans are in the business of deciding who has it and who doesn't. And last year, a collection of botanists, not botanists at all actually, biologists and philosophers, convened at NYU to put out this declaration saying that they could now probably bestow the substrates of consciousness onto fish and crustaceans and insects. And this was an expansion of an earlier declaration in 2012 where they bestowed it on mammals and birds. So we love to draw these lines in the sand, even if we don't always know what they mean. And some researchers say that it's now time to extend that circle wider to include plants. So if plants were intelligent or conscious, how would we know enough to tell? I wonder if maybe it would help to know that they can plan for the future. Scientists in recent decades have shown that plants can record and store memories to access later. And this plant is Nasa poisoniana. It grows in the Andes, very high up in Peru. And it produces these spectacular star-shaped plants and they have these stamen all laying down inside these concave canoe-like petals. And just a couple years ago, well, in 2019, which is longer ago than it feels, researchers discovered that it would raise these stamen exactly at the time interval it expected a pollinator to arrive. So it would record the time interval between pollinator visits, when a bee or a fly came, and raise its stamen only when it expected the bee to arrive. And this is a way for a plant that grows high up, where there's very few pollinators and lots of harsh weather, to protect its pollen, because at the end of each of these stamen is a little tuft of yellow pollen, and you don't want that getting blown away or washed away. And so when I went to Bonn to meet the researchers doing this work in a greenhouse, and they were playing the part of a bee by poking this plant at different intervals. And when they changed the interval, let's say from 45 minutes to an hour and a half between fake bee visits, the plant would anticipate the arrival of the next bee with the correct new interval. So this is one of many plants that have been discovered in the last 10 years to have memory, but no one knows where these memories are stored. Of course, we also don't know where many of our memories are stored. Perhaps it's also useful to understand that they have clear social networks. We now know that plants have elaborate social lives with alliances and enemies, and they behave differently towards their kin than they do towards stranger plants. Rice plants, for example, will compete with their neighbors aggressively below ground, growing very thin, noodly roots to try and dominate a patch of nutrients, unless their neighbors are genetically related to them. If they're planted beside close relations, rice plants, siblings or half-siblings, they will sort of confine their root systems and put more energy into making fruit, rice, which has clear implications for how we grow crops. This is the Asiatic broadleaf plantain, which is closely related to a weed in basically every lawn where I live, and probably here too. A single seed of an Asiatic broadleaf plantain plant, which are these brown seeds at the bottom here, can tell from a distance whether it's planted near a sibling or not. If two plantain sibling seeds are planted beside one another, and then they have another seed that's completely foreign to it, not related to it, planted beside them, the two sibling plantains will coordinate their germination to come up together to have a better chance of shading out that foreign plant. So we know a seed has everything it needs to understand kin relationship. Perhaps it's also helpful to understand they have a basic grasp of math. Venus flytraps can count. They can do both addition and subtraction. In their leaf maw, this trap, they have these little trigger hairs that you can see on the left. And those trigger hairs need to be triggered a certain number of times within a certain number of seconds in order for the trap to close. And they need to be triggered yet more times to start digestion. And this is how the Venus flytrap prevents digesting a twig, or trying to. They want a wriggling insect. If the trigger hairs are triggered and then the movement of the object stops and there's no more triggering, it will reset and open its leaf again. So that's the addition and the subtraction. Perhaps it's when we can understand that they can assess their environment to make spontaneous decisions to ensure their own flourishing. Tomato plants defend themselves in the most grotesque and elaborate ways. And one way is by encouraging caterpillars towards cannibalism. they change compounds in their leaves. So apparently caterpillars of this type are prone to cannibalism anyhow, but tomato plants will take it upon themselves to alter their leaf chemistry to promote cannibalism sooner than it would normally happen. So they look up from eating the leaves and turn to eat each other. But tomato plants can also do something else. They can, like all plants, synthesize complex compounds. But in their case, they will sample the saliva left over by the caterpillar, and then they know what species the caterpillar is, at least what species of parasitic wasp they need to come deal with the caterpillar for them. And they will synthesize a gas that attracts the parasitic wasp, and the wasp will inject its eggs into the caterpillar bodies. And the eggs hatch, the larvae eat the caterpillar from the inside out, and then they glue these little tic-tac-like husks, or cocoons rather, to the husk of the caterpillar. And I've been sent photos of this from gardeners. I can't grow tomatoes where I am, but I've heard this is something you can commonly see in your garden. Maybe intelligence of plants would have to do with their senses. Perhaps it helps to know that plants can hear. Roots can grow towards water running in sealed pipes, picking up on the acoustic vibrations, not the moisture itself, which probably isn't news to any plumber, any municipal worker, because that, root intrusion runs up huge bills to most cities. This is the beach evening primrose, which is the small yellow teacup-shaped flower. It can increase the sweetness of its nectar by 3 times when exposed to the sound of a bee flying, honeybee flight, just the audio recording of honeybee flight. Cress plants will boost their immune system in response to the sound of their genuine caterpillar predator chewing. And the sound of this chewing caterpillar has the same amplitude and frequency as many other insect noises. So when researchers tested the cress plants against a leafhopper noise, a mating call, which sounds very similar, but it had a different rhythmicity, the plant will do nothing to defend itself. It will only adjust its immune system in response to the genuine rhythm of its predator chewing. So plants like primroses and cress respond to sound, but that doesn't mean they can hear necessarily in the way we think of ourselves as hearing. To plants, sound is pure vibration, and vibration is a physical stimulus. In fact, when researchers plucked off a few of the petals from this evening primrose and broke the perfect symmetry of its bowl-shaped flower, it could no longer achieve that trick of sweetening its nectar. So that led the researcher to suggest that flowers make this bowl shape for exactly the same reason that satellite dishes are concave. And the researcher who made this discovery said that when she sees a field of flowers now, she sees a field of ears. Sure, ears. That functionally and anatomically, in a way, they're serving a similar purpose. So you're about to see a lot of pictures of my hand now, because I went to a rainforest in southern Chile to see a remarkable vine. This vine is called Boquilla trifoliolata, and it was recently discovered to be capable of mimicking nearly any plant it grew beside. It can alter its leaves' shape, color, texture, whether it's glossy or not, the vein pattern of its leaf, to mimic its neighbor. And it can do that without making contact with the neighbor, which is quite remarkable. This is its standard non-mimicking shape. And here is it mimicking a maidenhair fern. And here is it growing to quadruple or quintuple its standard leaf size, and thickening and darkening and making glossy its leaves to match another plant. And this one's my favorite because this is a baby Boquilla plant on the left, trying and failing to mimic a ranunculus plant on the right. And this plant on the right had just been introduced to this Chilean forest in the last 2 decades, which rules out the chance that this is an evolutionary relationship. 2 decades is not enough for there to be something like that happen. So this is spontaneous mimicry. So Bokila doesn't always do a good job of mimicking, but you can at least see how incredible it is to watch it try. And people are calling Bokila a chameleon vine because it appears to, this ability appears as useful as a chameleon's camouflage. It's basically a defense. If you look like everything around you, you're less likely to be eaten when a predator comes by. This has never been seen, or maybe just never been noticed in a plant before, this kind of spontaneous mimicry where you're mimicking many, many, many other species. And it's provoking a real fight in the botany world now about whether or not plants can, on some level, see. The argument is that how else would it be reproducing what is fundamentally an image, visual information of another plant? Now, there is an alternate theory that I think is even more alluring and bizarre that involves microbial invasion, and that suggests other wild things, but I will leave that for you when you read the book. But the vision hypothesis is backed slightly by the fact that plants have more photoreceptors in their leaves than we do in our eyes. We know that they can tell whether they're being shaded by a cloud or by a fellow plant. They can tell whether that fellow plant is genetically related to it based on the quality of light passing through its leaves. If you lean over them, they can theoretically tell whether your shirt is red or blue. And they are exquisitely sensitive to information from light because they have to be. They need to get out of the shade of another plant. They need to avoid getting too much light, or else they'd be scorched. So a life rooted in place makes all that information incredibly crucial. You can't run away, so you better be able to exquisitely sense everything happening around you. But both this potentially visually gifted vine and the hearing primrose bring up a very important caveat, which is that plants do not have brains. We have not found any central processing zone in a plant. This brings up the question of how then could information like light signals be transmitted into an image in the way that they are in our brain. And that's the center of this whole debate. How can any plant respond without a central processing center? One theory of the case is that it makes sense for plants not to have brains. Their evolutionary legacy didn't require them to have one. We evolved to run across landscapes and forage for food. We needed this compact, centralized processing center. And this is a picture of me with my compact, centralized processing center, standing in a Moreton Bay fig tree at the National Tropical Botanical Garden in Kauai, which is an amazing place. I encourage the trip. So plants, as opposed to us, evolved rooted in place. They evolved to be modular, with repeating identical parts that they can lose without great harm. You can lop off an arm of a plant and it will regrow one without much fuss. Perhaps then they evolved to have a more diffuse sort of whole body consciousness or ability to sense, an awareness that our human faculties might struggle to conceptualize. Each of their limbs seem capable of alerting their entire body to new information. They're made of disparate parts that somehow are coordinated into a whole. Perhaps their intelligence is something more like network intelligence. And yet they also have some systems that are strikingly similar to our own. To illustrate that point, I want to tell you about a trip I took to Madison, Wisconsin, in the bleakest part of winter. It was -12 outside, snow on the ground. And I had done this to myself in order to visit the lab of Simon Gilroy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison to pinch a mutant plant with tweezers. And I'm going to read that bit from the book. Gilroy takes me into his lab, where Jessica Fernandez, a molecular biologist on his team, brings us a flat of young tobacco and Arabidopsis plants she's reared herself, especially for my visit. They are each imbued with fluorescent jellyfish proteins that will make them glow. Sarah Swanson, the director of the department's microscopy center, joins us too. Swanson also happens to be married to Gilroy. Fernandez lightly drops the tray of plants on the lab bench, and a single leaf on one baby Arabidopsis plant catches the lip of a box, bending in half. "Don't stimulate them," says Swanson, wanting to conserve all the plant's reactivity for the microscope. She'd found it was best to startle them from a completely resting state. "It's okay, we'll let them recover," Fernandez says. "And then we'll torture them," adds Swanson. Swanson leads us into a small room dominated by a microscope attached to a computer monitor. She turns out the lights. Fernandez dips a pair of tweezers into a glutamate solution and hands them to me. Glutamate is the most important neurotransmitter in our own brains, and research had recently found that it plays a role in plant signaling too, boosting the signal. "Be sure to cross the midrib," Fernandez says, pointing to the thick vein running down the middle of each tiny leaf. "If I only pinch the edge of the leaf without bothering the big veins, the leaf will probably light up in response, but the signal won't travel to its other parts." The veins are the plant's information superhighway. Get the vein and the pulse will move all over the plant in a wave. I pinch it gingerly the first time, and I can feel the room's disappointment as we wait a few seconds in the dark for the image on the monitor to change. The leaf begins to light up, impressively to me, but I've seen Gilroy's videos and I do know it gets better than this. I find it difficult to enthusiastically wound the plant, but Fernandez dips the tweezers and hands them to me again, this time with the instructions to really go at it. I feel like I'm in a vegetal version of the Milgram shock experiment. Unwilling to let this room full of scientists down, I pinch harder this time. The difference is dramatic. The plant lights up like a Christmas tree. The veins are blazing like a neon sign. The green luminance moves from the wound site outward across the rest of the plant in a bioluminescent ripple. I am watching this plant experience a cascade of feeling, a wave of sensation. As the light travels along the vein system, the image reminds me of something. It looks unmistakably like the branching pattern of the nervous system. Swanson whoops. "Oh, heck yeah, that's what I'm talking about. That's deluxe." Gilroy hoots. "Save that one." Fernandez claps and saves the video to an archive. Within 2 minutes, distant parts of the plant have received the signal. Mammals use glutamate receptors to transmit signals quickly throughout their body, and it seems plants might too. The presence of neurotransmitters in plants brings up its own intriguing questions. If plants use neurotransmitters to send electrical signals, could they be said to have nervous systems? Before I can ask about any potential similarities, Gilroy anticipates my question. "Some of the molecular players might be the same," he says. "The glutamate receptors in plants look like the glutamate receptors in animals, but," he says, "it's not nervous conduction. There are no plant nerves. They just don't exist in plants." Still, he concedes that the systems themselves look a lot alike. The total lack of plant nerves didn't stop two scientific reviewers writing in a journal that Gilroy had found nervous system-like signaling in plants. The issue has even leaked out of plant sciences of late. In a paper titled "Broadening the Definition of a Nervous System to Better Understand the Evolution of Plants and Animals," neuroscientist Rodolfo Linas basically argues that it makes no sense to define a nervous system as something only animals can have, rather than defining it as a physiological system that could be present in other organisms in a different form. Defining it phylogenetically, meaning assigning it to only one portion of the tree of life, ignores the very real force of convergent evolution, where organisms separately evolved similar systems to deal with similar challenges. It happens all the time in evolution. A classic example is wings. Flight evolved separately in birds, bats, and insects to very similar effect. Eyes are another example. The eye lens has evolved separately many times. It's reasonable to imagine the nervous system as another case of convergent evolution. If a variety of nervous systems exist in nature, then what plants have is clearly one. If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. Why not call that a nervous system already? So here is what it looked like under the microscope when you pinch the plant. Again, there's the seconds ticking along the top left. Play that up one more time. And then here's what it looked like when his team put a caterpillar on a plant. And you can clearly see the sort of utility of this. The plant is alerting its whole body to this attack. I realized that up until this moment in Gilroy's lab, I had been really struggling to connect everything I was learning in the process of reporting this book to the actual plants in front of me. The theory and the reality felt very far apart. Plants' abilities felt literally incredible. I couldn't credit them to anything I could see. They felt like radio waves or magnetic poles. I accepted their existence, but I couldn't internalize their materiality. But watching the green light move through a plant body changed that for me. Suddenly it became very tangible. I was watching the plant becoming aware of its own way of my touch. This experience in Gilroy's lab also made me wonder, could the whole plant be something like a brain? I mulled this over for a little while and eventually worked up the courage to ask it of an actual botanist, someone who studied the way that leaves expand as they grow. Her name is Elizabeth van Valkenburg. She has her own section in this book. I'd saved this question for the very end of our interview, just in case she was entirely put off by it and just ended our conversation right there. And I asked it very sheepishly, could the whole plant be something like a brain? And I watched her smile, thinking I'd made a complete fool of myself. She leaned in a little and dropped her voice to a kind of comical whisper, and she said, I think you're right. I just don't talk about it. I want to be clear, everything I'm describing is at this burning core of a debate going on among botanists, which means this whole realm of inquiry is very unsettled. The things we're learning about plant behavior are based on good, sound, peer-reviewed science. All of the research in this book is peer-reviewed. But botanists are fighting about what their results mean. At one point, a couple of years ago, there was all of this academic venom being slung about the question of plant intelligence between those who'd like to start using these words for plants and those who think it's patently ridiculous, because quite understandably, they don't want to drape these human notions, these very flawed human notions of things like intelligence, which has been used to, divide humans from other humans for all of eternity. Didn't want to drape all of that on a whole other taxa of life that, it's not their business at all, the way that we use these words. But I do believe that in a decade or two from now, we'll have arrived at a completely new conception of plant life that transcends all this squabbling over language. And by then, I think these current anxieties will seem completely quaint. And I'm sorry if this next slide is disturbing to anyone. But it's useful to remember that science can dramatically change its mind. It wasn't very long ago that it was thought preposterous that animals like dogs could do something as simple as experience pain. Up until the end of the 19th century, there were still live surgery demonstrations happening on unanesthetized dogs, because feeling was thought to be only the domain of humans. But vivisections, these live dissections, ultimately came to an end not because science changed its mind about it, which it eventually did, but because groups of people came together and decided it was immoral to do this and protested the activity. Sometimes it's not science that has to change its mind, but the rest of us. In many ways, ideas like intelligence and consciousness are more suited to the realms of ethics and philosophy than they are to science itself. Perhaps it's us who need to change our minds on the matter. Deciding that plants are intelligent or even conscious could have major implications for all of us. Once you think of a thing that way, they transform from an object in your mind into a subject. And by doing that, you admit that thing into the realm of your moral imagination, your ethical regard. I know for me, everything I've learned about plants has changed my life permanently. It's granted me an immense sense of awe. I'm now completely in awe of plants, and awe invariably leads directly away from disrespect and towards respect, leads away from exploitation. It has also re-enchanted my life in ways I didn't expect. I live in Brooklyn near a very big park, and when I walk through that park now, I feel exquisitely aware of the plant dramas happening all around me. I don't see this swath of green. I see myriad individuals with their own lifestyles, their own proclivities, and they're each actively pursuing their own flourishing. So I want to leave you with a reminder, setting aside all these fantastic new things we're learning about plants, they do one thing that I still think is the most incredible of all. They eat light. The title of this book comes from a quote by the late Timothy Plowman, an ethnobotanist, who thought this whole squabbling over whether or not plants were intelligent was ridiculous, and he thought it was irrelevant. He said, "They eat light. Isn't that enough?" And it should be. Without photosynthesis, without this plant light eating, we would never have stepped onto the evolutionary treadmill at all. Our ancestors could never have had a chance to evolve. When plants first climbed out of the ocean some 500 million years ago to colonize the land, the atmosphere was an inhospitable fog of hydrogen and carbon dioxide. Only plants at the time could unlock oxygen from carbon dioxide by using pure light energy to tear apart carbon and water molecules and rearrange them. The result of all that light eating was oxygen, which they breathed back out through these little fish lip-shaped pores on their leaves. These are called stomata. This is what they look like under a microscope. But by incessantly breathing out, these legions of early land plants tipped the balance of gases towards oxygenation. They created the atmosphere we now enjoy. It's really not a stretch to say they birthed the habitable world. So plants suffuse our atmosphere with oxygen, but they also quite literally build our bodies out of the sugars that they spin from sunlight. A leaf is the only thing in our terrestrial world, apart from very few fungi, that can manufacture sugar out of materials, light and air, that have never been alive. The rest of us are just recyclers. Glucose, plant sugar, is also the result of photosynthesis, and plants use it to build their own bodies, and in turn, by eating them, we build ours. Every animal was built with sugar from plants. Our muscles and our bones still carry the signature of these plant molecules, excuse me. Likewise, every thought that passes through your brain, which runs chiefly on glucose, was sponsored by a plant you at some point ate. So you thinking right now about plants was made possible by plants. That completely inverts the hierarchy that many of us were raised with, this sort of the Western European thought tradition that can be traced back to the dawn of rationalism, to Aristotle's ladder of life, which placed man at the top and plants somewhere at the bottom between the lower animals and perhaps above rocks. At some point that got Christianized. This is a version with God at the top and then angels and then man. But plants, you can still see the very cute trees at the bottom there. In all these iterations, plants are more like passive instruments, not active creatures in their own right. But of course, indigenous knowledge all over the world has known better for a long time. Plants are the primary organisms, and we are secondary or possibly even tertiary to them. While reporting this book, I happened to read another book called Plants Have So Much to Give Us, All We Have to Do Is Ask. It's a collection of traditional Anishinaabe teachings about plants, in which Mary Sizip-Genius writes that from the perspective of her Great Lakes area tribe, plants are the world's second brothers, created just after the elder brother forces of rain and rocks and soil. Plants are dependent on the elder brothers for their lives, but not dependent on anything that came after them. Non-human animals are third brothers, dependent on the second brothers and the elder brothers. Humanity then is the youngest brother, the most recently created and the most dependent of all beings. Humans alone need all three other brothers to survive while giving very little back. Humans are not the lords of this earth, Genius writes. We are the babies of this family of ours. We are the weakest because we are the most dependent. I think that idea profoundly settles us back into our place in the world, which is a very humble place. We are not some pinnacle on the evolutionary tree or the top of a ladder. Evolution is, of course, not linear, and it's not hierarchical. We are each nodes in an entangled web. We are just one example of an endlessly unfurling project of biological creativity. And we are very linked by our total dependence. Perhaps ours is not the only way to be clever. Certainly our way of doing things is not the only way to be creatures with agency over the direction of our lives, a talent for planning for the future, or the capacity to make wise, spontaneous decisions in a complex and endlessly shifting world. So are plants intelligent? Are they conscious? Does it even matter? They literally give us our lives. I want to leave you with a quote from science historian Thomas Kuhn, who said that a scientific paradigm shift changes one's view of the world in which we live. Of course, the world itself stays the same, and plants will go on being plants no matter what we decide to think of them. Thank you all so much. I think I get to take questions now. The what? The lightning bugs. Oh, where are they now? They're declining, right? I don't know a lot about this, but it's very upsetting to me too. Anyone else? Yes?
What got you started in this field?
I am a climate reporter, and I was at a different newsroom a number of years ago, and I got incredibly burnt out covering climate change, just depressed, as you can imagine. And my editor and I decided I should go cover something else for a while. And I have always loved plants. I don't have a background in botany, but I started reading botany journals instead of climate change journals, and that was a huge improvement on my mental health. But I also became totally transfixed. The first fern genome was sequenced around this time. Fern genomes are huge, so this was a big deal. But the fern that they sequenced the genome of is this tiny little fern called Zoë Schlanger. And I saw a picture of it, and I totally fell in love. And it's very sweet. You have to look it up. It's like the size of a thumbnail. And I called the researchers behind this, and one of them happened to be at a botany conference, and he's like, "Do you want me to get more fern scientists on the phone?" So then I had a conference call with 6 fern scientists. And they were so delightful to speak to, so full of awe and love for their subjects. And I decided that's who I wanted to talk to for a few years. So I quit my job. And now I'm back to climate reporting, and it's still depressing, but this was very helpful.
I don't have a question, but for all of you who have not read her book yet, as far as like the way you write is basically how you're hearing her give this presentation. But I loved especially when you did go into the Chilean rainforest and you actually found the plant on your own, the mimicry one, and as far as you were so excited because they're going everywhere, and to be able to find one on your own, and did they name it? Did you get it named also?
I was told they would cite me if they published about it. I don't know if that was them being very sweet. No, I found the first instance of a boquila, that vine mimicking a fern. It was the maidenhair fern in that picture. But this is one of these plants, this vine in Chile. There's one team studying it where it lives. People are studying it in labs. And so every time they go to this forest, they find new examples of it mimicking new species. So it was very fun to get to add. I think I got the 21st one or something like that. Thank you for that.
Zoe, your book is amazing.
Thank you.
I mean, last year at Chicago, they had the oldest continuously running book club in Chicago Literary Guild.
Uh-huh.
Every week has a book of choice to read. Yours is one of them.
Amazing.
And many there would tell me about it, and I was reading other things. But my question to you is, how did you make that transition to deep dive? I mean, I'm about halfway through your book, and I'm so impressed. I'm highlighting all kinds of things to it.
Thank you.
But there's so much science in there. It would, to me, I thought perhaps the writer was in her 80s.
How do you know I'm not? Thank you, first of all, for your kind words. I so appreciate that. I am a science reporter, so I've been covering science for 12 years or something, and the job is to read a lot of scientific papers and synthesize them and talk to scientists in their language, but translate it into the language for the public. So it's that kind of horizontal communication work, but also research work that prepared me for this, and it was really just a delight to sort of turn it from, the destruction of the planet to like the flourishing of the planet. So it was very fun. I mean, I feel like I have the best job in the world, just getting to talk to all these amazing researchers, and they will give me their time. It's like getting a master class all the time. So, yeah.
Your interpretation of what you learned is outstanding.
I so appreciate that. Thank you.
I don't have a question, but I do have a very short experience to share.
Sure.
In our breakfast nook, I have plants, lots of plants. And I noticed one day I had a geranium that I had brought in from outside and a pothos next to each other. And the pothos had taken one of its trailing vines and wrapped around the pot of the geranium. And when I looked closer, I realized the pot of the geranium was about to fall.
Huh.
And as soon as I moved it back, the pothos dropped.
Hey, cool. Look at that.
And I know all about it.
That's amazing. One of the abiding mysteries in plant science is how plants sense gravity. Like, we still don't completely know why they will grow upwards each time they're tipped over. The way we deal with our upwardness, our gravity, has to do with, I haven't done human science research necessarily, but calcium crystals or crystals falling in our ear, brushing against little trichome hairs. Plants don't have that. So we still haven't found that physical mechanism for how they sense in real-time gravity. So you were just watching a beautiful botanical mystery in action.
My plants, and I dropped their leaves. And they're healthy as can be.
Well, you're probably activating their immune system. You're probably like bothering them enough that they're on high alert all the time, which is good. It can prevent disease in some species, so not a bad thing.
Experiments to show that plants actually sense gravity? I mean, will they turn? I always thought they just turn towards the light. Is that not the case?
They turn towards the light, but they also turn up.
Is that right?
Yeah, if you tip over a plant, it'll just start growing up eventually again. Yeah.
Is there any thought that plants have a soul? I mean, if they have intelligence and a consciousness, it seems like there might be a natural evolution to a soul.
I think that's a deeply theological question. Yeah, it depends where you locate the soul in humans, as someone said. And these are interesting questions that used to be part of scientific research back in the days of, the philosopher naturalists, back in Darwin's time, Humboldt's time. But since then, we've separated those questions from the hard research, the ethics, philosophy, theology. And I'm sure that's at Harvard Theological Seminary is having a conference on this topic in May. So tune in. I think there will be virtual panels. It's a really interesting conversation.
So are there any conversations happening between the botanists and the climate change people in terms of worldview and what all of this phenomenal information and discovery can help us do with climate change?
Yes, absolutely. There's a really well-funded ongoing study, mostly in Europe right now, about how increasing levels of CO2 in the atmosphere will affect photosynthesis. So, I'm sure you've heard the idea that it's, CO2 is good for plants. It's only good for plants up to a point, and then it's a problem. So, there's labs thinking through what that means for farming. This fern that I mentioned, Azolla, is being studied because it fixes so much. It absorbs CO2 at such a high rate that it was around back when the Arctic was tropical, and it was part of what helped reverse that climatic regime because it absorbed so much CO2. So there are scientists looking into whether or not it could be deployed to help with that again. So absolutely, there's a lot of intersection.
When you were in Chile, you got to see the national flower, the copiwe. Copiwe?
Is it red?
Yes.
Yes, I did. I saw one. It was amazing. Absolutely.
My question is more of an agronomy question regarding plant behavior with Roundup, glyphosate, and what trends do you think scientists, the plant people around the world in terms of food production, working with glyphosate, what do you think we're going to have a dead end there, or do you think that plants will just allow us to figure out the next strategy?
The one thing that this makes me think of, this question about glyphosate, is in thinking through this idea of mimicry for this book, this Bokila vine, I was also thinking about another form of mimicry called Pavlovian mimicry, which is a very common thing in farm fields where a crop will start, or sorry, a weed in a crop field will start to take on physical characteristics of the crop. And that's how we got rye as an edible species, because it was a weed in wheat fields. Right now, vetch, which is a weed in lentil fields, will change the shape of its seeds to avoid being winnowed out by a winnowing machine. So there is, I think his name is Scott McElroy, there's a weed genomicist who believes that plants' ability to develop immunity to things like glyphosate is it doing Pavlovian mimicry at a biochemical level, that they are mimicking, plants are engineered to withstand glyphosate so that the glyphosate only kills the weeds, but that over time perhaps the weeds are biochemically mimicking the crop to withstand it. So that's the only thing that question makes me think of, but
Follows natural.
sure, but it happens quite quickly, which is crazy.
Very few things go through the whole life cycle.
Yes, plants are good for generations, definitely.
The chemical reactions in the leaves that you see in your face, obviously we perceive them much as we perceive human thought or reactions in MRIs. You can see a similar reaction to such devices. Clearly, there's a speed limit to the reaction, and clearly, the individuals that do this research can see what chemicals exist prior to this reaction under a full generating chemical. So I would think it would be relatively easy to determine before, during, and after what you're actually seeing occur. I mean, obviously you're generating light from that full chemical reaction. But again, you don't have a nervous system in the sense of higher animals. Clearly, you have a relationship between the cellular structures and the release of these chemicals that are triggered by your pinching.
Totally.
No idea. Question is before, during, and after.
I don't follow the question, I'm sorry.
What are the chemicals that change to create this observable reaction?
Which reaction?
The fact that you can see by pinching it?
Oh, thank you. Sorry, that's what I missed. It's, okay, let's see. So, the pinch is, the theory is that it's bursting the walls of a cell, essentially, that's containing a chemical that promotes cellular communication. Okay, so the light that you're seeing in those images is actually calcium ions going up in the cell, which is a reporter for probable electricity moving through the cell. So it's not, you're not directly watching electricity move through, it's calcium. But they presume it's also electrical. That's the harder thing to detect. You had a question.
So, was publishing and obviously there's some time between now and then. What research about plants that has come since that time? Are you able to share with us, or one particular study
Yeah, there's so much happening in this field all the time. The question was, what has happened since I published this in this field? Even during the fact-checking stage, there were things happening that I wanted to add that I couldn't. One fun study is happening, the same researcher who discovered the beach evening primrose, able to increase the sweetness of its nectar with the sound of bee buzzing, is now researching the sounds that plants make themselves. So there's something called cavitation clicks in the stem of plants. There's bubbles in the fluid that's moving in the xylem, and those bubbles pop and make an audible noise. It's needs amplification for us to hear it, but plenty of animals can hear this noise. And she was looking at that as a reporter for whether or not the plant was under stress, whether dehydrated, had a disease. She trained and did machine learning program to detect that, and ended up also finding that she could figure out what species the plant was based on their cavitation click noises. So now she's looking at whether or not any animals use these to their benefit in some way, like maybe an animal that lays its eggs on a leaf wouldn't want to lay its egg on a stressed plant based exclusively on the noises. So that's a totally new world of phytoacoustics where we consider plants to be the emitting source of sound.
Thank you for an amazing book, and
Thanks.
I'll add your narration of the audiobook is also delightful. So for
Thank
anyone
you.
who's interested in audiobooks, this is a great one. A quote that I thought was really powerful towards the end of the book was when you said, pessimism forecloses on the imagination of hope. And I think that's such a really powerful concept that as we are bombarded with daily news of the destruction of the planet and everything that is going wrong, how easily that leads to a place of apathy and hopelessness.
Mm-hmm.
And can you talk a bit about how you see this work as part of working to cultivate hope in the face of that?
Thank you for that. Yeah, everything you just said about hope and everything I think about hope as it relates to the climate crisis. Rebecca Solnit writes really beautifully about this, that hope is this constant choice. Of course, she's not the only one who thinks like this, but it is a constant choice that we all have to make to maintain some hope. The opposite is totally just losing any animus to do anything about anything. And I don't really think anyone has the right to have the opposite of hope. It's very tempting, which is part of why I chose the moment I got really numb to climate news to step away from it. I think there's things happening all the time that one can draw hope from, and that is where all action stems from. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but it is a choice, it's an active choice, and I think we all have to make that.
I think this book plays a really important part of that conversation. So
I appreciate
really
that.
kudos.